Hey guys, tonight we begin with a scene that would make even the most depraved reality TV producer blush. It's ancient Rome, sometime around 48 AD, and in a dingy brothel tucked away in the shadiest corner of the Subura district, a woman is competing against the city's most famous prostitute to see who can service more men in a single night. The crowd is cheering, coins are changing hands, and the air reeks of wine, sweat, and poor life choices. The woman in question, she's just won the contest. 25 men, count them, 25, and she's not even breathing hard. She collects her prize money with a satisfied smirk, pulls her hood back up, and slips into the night like a particularly satisfied shadow. Oh, and did I mention, this woman happens to be the Empress of Rome, the wife of Emperor Claudius, the most powerful woman in the known world. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and she had just set a record that would make modern influencers weep with envy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because tonight we're diving into the story of a woman who took the phrase power corrupts and turned it into an art form. A woman who made Roman orgies look like church picnics. A woman who was so spectacularly, catastrophically promiscuous that even ancient Romans who weren't exactly prudes were absolutely horrified by her behavior. This is the story of Empress Valeria Messalina. And trust me, by the end of this tale you'll understand why being called worse than Messalina became Rome's ultimate insult for the next 1,000 years. Your story begins around 17 or 20 AD, depending on which historian you trust. And frankly, given what we're about to discuss, the exact date seems almost quaint in comparison to what's coming. You're born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which sounds impressive until you realize this is the same family tree that produced Caligula, Nero, and enough palace intrigue to make Game of Thrones look like a documentary about knitting. Your full name is Valeria Messalina, and you arrive during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a man so paranoid he eventually fled to the island of Capri to live out his days in what ancient historians politely called retirement, and what we might more accurately describe as a sex dungeon with a view. Your father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, is a consul, which in Roman terms means he's important enough to have opinions but not quite important enough to avoid getting murdered if those opinions annoy the wrong people. Your mother, Domitia Lepida, comes from even more impressive stock, being directly descended from Mark Antony and Augustus himself. So congratulations, little Messalina. You've been born into the most dysfunctional, violent, sexually deviant family in the history of Western civilization. It's like being born into a mafia family, except the mafia had better table manners and fewer incestuous relationships. From the very beginning, there's something different about you. While other patrician girls are learning to weave and memorize poetry, you're apparently studying the finer points of manipulation, seduction, and how to get what you want through means that would make a modern politician blush. Not that anyone's really paying attention to your moral education, of course. Your family is too busy scheming, murdering, and occasionally governing the largest empire in human history. The Rome you grow up in is a city of contradictions. It's the most civilized place on earth, with aqueducts, public baths, and libraries that would make modern cities jealous. It's also a place where gladiators fight to the death for entertainment, where slaves are treated like furniture, and where emperors regularly marry their sisters because, hey, why let good bloodlines go to waste? Your childhood is spent in luxury that's almost impossible to imagine. Marble floors, silk curtains, servants who exist solely to taste your food in case someone's trying to poison you, which, given your family history, is a reasonable precaution. You have tutors for everything: rhetoric, philosophy, music, dance, and probably a few subjects that aren't mentioned in polite company. But here's the thing about growing up in the imperial family. Luxury comes with a price. That price is living in constant fear of assassination, exile, or worse. Your relatives have a nasty habit of disappearing in the middle of the night, sometimes literally, sometimes just politically. One day they're dining with the emperor, the next day they're feeding fish in the Tiber River. This environment, this constant tension between absolute power and absolute vulnerability, shapes you in ways that will become terrifyingly clear later. You learn early that the only person you can truly trust is yourself. You learn that power is the only thing that matters, and you learn that conventional morality is a luxury for people who don't have the strength to take what they want. As you enter your teenage years, it becomes clear that you're not going to be content with the traditional role of a Roman matron, spinning wool and managing household slaves. Please, you have bigger ambitions, much bigger, and absolutely no moral qualms about how you achieve them. When you're around 15, which in Roman terms makes you practically an old maid, the family starts shopping you around the marriage market like a particularly valuable piece of livestock. This isn't about love, obviously. This is about political alliances, territorial claims, and ensuring that the Julio-Claudian bloodline continues its proud tradition of producing rulers who make Caligula look reasonable. The first husband they find for you is Gaius Silius, not the Gaius Silius who will later feature prominently in your spectacular downfall, mind you. That's a different Gaius Silius. Rome apparently had a real shortage of creative names, so they just recycled the same ones over and over until keeping track became a full-time job for future historians. This first marriage is by all accounts perfectly normal by Roman standards, which is to say it's a business transaction dressed up with some religious ceremonies and a really expensive party. Silius is from a good family, he's got money, and he's young enough that he probably won't die of natural causes before producing an heir. But here's where things start to get interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply disturbing, because even as a teenager, you're already showing signs of the sexual appetite that will eventually make you the most infamous woman in Roman history. Marriage, it turns out, is not going to satisfy your particular needs. The problem isn't that Silius is inadequate, though given what's coming, he might as well have been a eunuch for all the difference it would have made. The problem is that you've discovered you have the sexual appetite of a particularly energetic deity, combined with the moral restraint of a hungry shark. Privactict. You start small, of course. An affair here, a dalliance there. Nothing too scandalous by Roman imperial standards. After all, this is a society where Caligula made his horse a consul and regularly slept with his sisters. A little adultery barely registers on the scandal scale, but you're not content with small scandals. You're ambitious, and your ambitions unfortunately extend far beyond what any one husband or 10 husbands could possibly satisfy. Silius, poor man, probably thinks he's married to a normal, if particularly enthusiastic Roman wife. He has no idea he's actually married to a woman who will eventually make nymphomaniacs look like nuns. He's like a man who bought a house cat and woke up to find he'd actually adopted a tiger. The marriage doesn't last long, not because of your extracurricular activities, which are still relatively discreet at this point, but because of good old-fashioned Roman politics. Silius gets involved in some plot or other, the kind of half-baked conspiracy that passes for political discourse in imperial Rome and ends up dead, or exiled, or both. The historical record is a bit fuzzy on the details, mostly because what happens to your first husband pales in comparison to the epic catastrophe that is your life. But his death, or disappearance, or whatever actually happened to him, sets you free. Free to pursue your true calling. Free to explore the depths of your own depravity. Free to become the most sexually voracious woman in the history of the Roman Empire. And trust me, in a civilization that invented the orgy and perfected the art of decadent excess, that's really saying something. In 38 AD, your life takes a turn that would be considered absurdly fortunate if we didn't know how it all ends. Emperor Caligula, in one of his brief moments of not being completely insane, decides you would make an excellent wife for his uncle Claudius. Now, Claudius is not exactly a catch by conventional standards. He's older than you by about 26 years. He's got a stutter that makes him sound like a broken wine jug. He drools occasionally. He walks with a limp that suggests someone used him as a battering ram at some point in his youth. His own family considers him such an embarrassment that they've spent decades hiding him from public view. But here's the thing about Claudius that nobody sees coming. He's actually intelligent, brilliant even. While the rest of the imperial family has been busy murdering each other and declaring war on Neptune, Claudius has been quietly studying history, law, and statecraft. He's written books, he speaks multiple languages, he's got the kind of mind that could actually run an empire, if anyone bothered to ask him. Of course, you're not particularly interested in his mind. You're 18 years old, devastatingly beautiful, and about to become part of the imperial family, the actual imperial family, not just the extended crazy cousin version you've been part of until now. This is your ticket to real power, real influence, and most importantly, real freedom to do whatever you want without consequences. The wedding is a spectacle that makes modern celebrity weddings look like backyard barbecues. Half of Rome turns out to watch, partly because imperial weddings are always good entertainment, and partly because people want to see if Claudius can actually make it through the ceremony without falling over. He manages it, barely, and suddenly you're Valeria Messalina, wife of the future emperor. Not that anyone expects Claudius to actually become emperor, of course. He's fourth in line at best, and given the family's habit of murdering each other, those aren't great odds. But fate, as it turns out, has a twisted sense of humor. 4 Ivan 20 AD, just 3 years after your marriage, Caligula gets himself assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, which would normally mean the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Except the guards panic and realize they need to find a replacement emperor quickly before the Senate remembers it. Used to run things. They find Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, apparently convinced he's about to be murdered like his nephew. Instead, they drag him out, stick a crown on his head, and congratulate him on becoming the most powerful man in the world. And just like that, you go from being a minor imperial wife to being the Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the known world. The wife of a man who controls legions, provinces, and enough wealth to buy small countries. If this were a normal story, this would be where you settle into a life of quiet dignity, using your position to advance worthy causes and support your husband's reign. But this isn't a normal story. This is the story of Messalina, and you're just getting started. Power, it turns out, suits you like a perfectly fitted toga. Within months of Claudius becoming emperor, you've established yourself as a force to be reckoned with in imperial politics. You attend Senate meetings, you influence appointments, you have your own court, your own followers, your own network of spies and informants, and you discover something intoxicating. When you're the empress, people will do absolutely anything you ask, anything. Trotter first, you use this power for relatively normal imperial wife activities. You commission buildings, you patronize artists, you throw parties that make previous imperial entertainments look like children's birthday celebrations. Rome's elite compete desperately for invitations to your gatherings, partly because they're genuinely spectacular, and partly because being excluded might be interpreted as disloyalty to the imperial family. But gradually, your parties start to acquire a reputation. They last longer than is strictly appropriate. The wine flows more freely than is entirely wise. The entertainment becomes more creative. And you, the hostess, start to behave in ways that make your guests wonder if they've accidentally wandered into a very expensive brothel. It starts subtly. A hand placed a little too intimately on a senator's arm. A smile that promises more than just political favor. A way of looking at men that makes them forget they're married. Forget they have reputations to maintain. Forget everything except the possibility that the Empress of Rome might be interested in them. Your husband, poor Claudius, is either oblivious or pretending to be oblivious. He's busy running an empire after all. There are wars to fight, provinces to govern, infrastructure projects to oversee. If his wife wants to socialize with Rome's elite, well, that's what imperial wives do, isn't it? Besides, Claudius genuinely loves you. This isn't a political marriage for him anymore, if it ever was. He's a lonely, awkward man who never expected to find love, let alone with someone as beautiful and vivacious as you. When he looks at you, he sees the miracle of his life, the proof that sometimes the gods do smile on stammering historians who become emperor by accident. What he doesn't see, because he doesn't want to see it, is that you're already planning your next move, because parties and political influence are all well and good, but they're not enough. They don't satisfy the hunger that's been growing inside you since childhood, the hunger for more excitement, more sensation, more of everything that makes life worth living. You need challenges, you need risks, you need the kind of thrills that can only come from doing things that would destroy you if anyone found out. And fortunately for your particular appetites, Rome is full of men who are very, very interested in helping the Empress find new ways to entertain herself. Your real education begins not in childhood, but in the first year of Claudius's reign, and your teachers aren't tutors or philosophers. They're freedmen, slaves, gladiators, actors, and various other members of Roman society who exist outside the rigid moral constraints that supposedly govern the imperial family. You discover that being empress comes with certain opportunities that aren't typically mentioned in the official job description. For instance, you can summon anyone to the palace at any time for any reason. A senator's wife who catches your eye, a particularly attractive slave from the markets, a gladiator whose performance in the arena was especially impressive. Your tastes, it becomes clear, are remarkably democratic. You're equally interested in aristocrats and commoners, Romans and foreigners, free men and slaves. What matters isn't their social status or their wealth. What matters is whether they can provide you with new experiences, new sensations, new ways to push the boundaries of what's possible. Your methodology is simple and devastatingly effective. You identify someone who interests you. You invite them to a private audience. You make it clear that refusing the Empress's advances would be unwise. And then you take what you want. The beauty of it, from your perspective, is that no one can refuse you, no one can expose you, no one can even complain about you, because you're not just any woman pursuing extramarital affairs. You're the Empress of Rome. Crossing you doesn't just mean social embarrassment, it means exile, imprisonment, or death. So your victims, and let's be honest about what they are, smile and nod and pretend to be honored by your attention. They tell themselves they're serving the empire. They convince themselves that satisfying the Empress's desires is a patriotic duty. They do whatever mental gymnastics are necessary to avoid facing the reality that they're being sexually coerced by the most powerful woman in the world. And you're having the time of your life. Triumphine agra. Each conquest teaches you something new about power, about pleasure, about the fascinating ways that fear and desire can become indistinguishable. You're not just collecting sexual partners, you're conducting experiments in human nature. You're exploring the outer limits of what people will do when they have no choice. The servants whisper, of course. Palace staff always whisper, but they whisper quietly, and they're very careful about who they whisper to, because servants who spread rumors about the imperial family have a habit of disappearing in the middle of the night. Claudius remains oblivious, bless his scholarly heart. He's too busy being emperor to pay much attention to what his wife does with her days. And when he does notice that you seem particularly happy, particularly energetic, he assumes it's because you're finally adjusting to imperial life. He has no idea that his wife is methodically working her way through every attractive man in Rome, like a particularly determined plague. But private conquests in the imperial palace, thrilling as they are, eventually begin to feel routine. You're a woman who needs novelty, who craves the unexpected. Palace affairs, no matter how numerous or creative, are still fundamentally safe. You're on your own territory, surrounded by your own people, protected by your position, and safety, it turns out, bores you. So you start venturing outside the palace walls. At first just to private homes of the wealthy, attending parties where the entertainment is more adventurous than what would be appropriate in the emperor's residence. Rome's elite, it turns out, are more than happy to provide whatever entertainment the empress desires, no matter how bizarre or depraved. But even elite parties have their limits. There are still social conventions to maintain, reputations to protect. Even Rome's most debauched aristocrats draw the line somewhere. You, however, have no interest in lines. Should we start exploring the Suburra, Rome's red light district? At first you go disguised, hooded and cloaked like any other wealthy woman seeking anonymous thrills. You sample the offerings at various establishments, always careful to maintain your anonymity, always accompanied by trusted guards who understand that discretion is literally a matter of life and death. And that's when you discover the competitions, Roman brothels. It turns out occasionally host contests to determine which of their workers can service the most clients in a single night. It's part entertainment, part advertisement, part gambling opportunity for the customers. The winner gets prize money and bragging rights. The losers get experience and slightly less money. For most people, this would be a spectacle to watch, perhaps to bet on. For you, it's an irresistible challenge, because you've discovered something about yourself that even you didn't expect. You're competitive about sex, the way other people are competitive about chariot racing or gladiatorial combat. You don't just want to have more partners than is reasonable or appropriate. You want to have more partners than anyone else in the history of Rome. The first time you participate, you do it almost as a joke, a lark, a way to see if the Empress of Rome can outperform professional prostitutes at their own game. You not only win, you win decisively. 25 men in a single night, outlasting Scylla, Rome's most famous and accomplished prostitute. You collect your prize money, not because you need it, but because winning it proves that you've accomplished something genuinely extraordinary. And then you do it again and again. Because it turns out that for you, the thrill isn't just in the sex itself, it's in the competition, the challenge, the knowledge that you're doing something so extreme, so outrageous, that even in a city known for its excess, people are genuinely shocked. You're not just breaking taboos anymore, you're obliterating them. You're taking everything Roman society considers sacred about marriage, about imperial dignity, about feminine virtue, and you're grinding it all into dust with your bare hands. And the most remarkable part, you're enjoying every minute of it. Your brothel adventures might have remained a secret indefinitely if you had been content to simply win competitions and collect prize money. But secrecy was never really your style. You're not someone who does remarkable things and then keeps quiet about them. You're someone who does remarkable things because you want people to know you've done them. So you start to be less careful about your disguises. You start to visit brothels during busier times, when more people might recognize you. You start to make comments, casual references, hints that let certain people know exactly what the Empress of Rome has been up to during her nights out. The reaction is everything you hoped for, and more. Rome's elite are scandalized in ways they didn't know were possible. This is a society that has seen emperors marry their sisters, declare war on the ocean, and appoint horses to the Senate. But somehow, the idea of the empress personally competing in brothel contests crosses a line that even jaded Roman aristocrats didn't know existed. The whispers start in the forums and spread to the bathhouses. They creep through the Senate and infiltrate the army camps. Everyone knows someone who claims to have seen the empress in action. The stories grow in the telling, becoming more elaborate and shocking with each repetition. Some of the stories are probably true. Many of them are certainly false, but all of them serve your purposes perfectly, because they all reinforce the same message. Messalina fears nothing, and no one. Messalina does exactly what she wants, when she wants, with whoever she wants. Messalina is beyond the reach of conventional morality. And in a strange way, this makes you more powerful, not less, because now everyone knows that the normal rules don't apply to you. Anyone who deals with you understands that they're dealing with someone who operates outside the usual constraints of imperial behavior. Senators who might normally try to manipulate an emperor's wife through flattery and gifts now approach you with the kind of nervous respect usually reserved for unpredictable wild animals. They know that crossing you won't just result in political consequences. It might result in public humiliation designed to destroy their reputations and their families. Because you've demonstrated something crucial, you have absolutely nothing to lose. You've already thrown away every conventional source of female power and dignity. You've already violated every social norm that matters. What's left for anyone to threaten you with? This immunity gives you a kind of freedom that no Roman woman has ever possessed. You can say anything, do anything, demand anything, because you've already paid the price for extreme behavior. You've already sacrificed your reputation on the altar of your appetites. The only question is, what are you going to do with all that freedom? By 47 AD, you've been empress for 6 years, and your reputation has reached levels of notoriety that would impress Caligula. But you've also reached a point where ordinary scandals no longer provide the thrill they once did. Sleeping with senators, competing in brothels, publicly humiliating your social rivals, it's all become routine. You need something bigger, something that will shock even Rome's jaded elite, something that will prove once and for all that there are no limits to what you're willing to do, provided sounds. And that's when you meet Gaius Silius. Not your first husband, remember, but a different Gaius Silius. This one is young, handsome, wealthy, and possessed of the kind of classical Roman beauty that makes sculptors weep with inspiration. He's also a consul-elect, which means he's politically important enough to matter. More importantly, he's exactly stupid enough to think that an affair with the Empress will advance his career rather than end his life. Your relationship with Silius starts as just another conquest. Another powerful man reduced to a stammering mess by your attention. Another victory in your ongoing war against conventional morality. But something unexpected happens. For the first time in your adult life, you find yourself actually enjoying someone's company outside of bed. Silius is charming, witty, ambitious in ways that remind you of yourself. He doesn't just want to sleep with the Empress. He wants to be part of her world, part of her schemes, part of her relentless assault on Roman propriety. And that's when you get the idea that will ultimately destroy you both. Why settle for an affair when you could have something much more dramatic? Why sneak around like a common adulteress when you could do something that will be talked about for centuries? Why not marry him? Not divorce Claudius first, obviously. That would be too simple, too conventional. No, you decide to marry Silius while remaining married to the emperor. Bigamy with a side of treason, seasoned with public humiliation for your husband, and garnished with a complete destruction of imperial dignity. It's the kind of plan that could only have been conceived by someone who has spent years systematically destroying every barrier between desire and action. It's ambitious, outrageous, and absolutely guaranteed to end in catastrophe. In other words, it's perfect. The ceremony takes place in 48 AD, while Claudius is away in Ostia overseeing grain shipments, which shows either remarkable strategic thinking on your part or remarkable stupidity, depending on how you look at it. On one hand, marrying your lover while your husband is out of town does provide a certain amount of tactical advantage. On the other hand, it also ensures that when he finds out, he'll have time to organize a response. But you're past caring about tactical advantages or strategic thinking. You're operating on pure impulse now, driven by the intoxicating conviction that you can do anything you want and somehow escape the consequences. The wedding itself is a masterpiece of public scandal. You don't try to keep it secret. Instead, you invite half of Rome's elite to witness your marriage to Silius. You wear a proper wedding dress. You exchange rings. You perform all the traditional Roman marriage rituals with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that makes the entire proceeding legally binding. Your guests attend in a state of horrified fascination. They can't quite believe what they're witnessing, but they also can't look away. It's like watching someone set themselves on fire while insisting it's the latest fashion trend. Silius, for his part, seems to believe that this marriage somehow makes him co-emperor. He starts making political plans, issuing orders, acting as if his new status as your husband gives him some kind of legitimate claim to imperial authority, which reveals the fundamental flaw in your entire scheme. You've spent so much time thinking about how to shock people that you've forgotten to think about what happens after you shock them. Because while you're celebrating your new marriage and Silius is planning his imperial career, word is racing toward Ostia at the speed of terrified messengers. Claudius is about to learn that his wife has publicly married another man while he was away on official business. And Claudius, whatever his other flaws, is still the emperor of Rome. He still commands the Praetorian Guard. He still has the power to order executions without trial. Most importantly, he's about to learn that his beloved wife, the woman he trusted above all others, has been playing him for a fool for years. The news reaches Claudius while he's inspecting grain warehouses, probably the most boring possible moment to learn that your wife has committed bigamy, treason, and public humiliation, all in one spectacularly efficient afternoon. According to the historians, Claudius's first reaction is disbelief, not because he can't imagine you being unfaithful. By this point, even he has heard some of the rumors, but because he can't imagine anyone being stupid enough to marry someone else while still married to the Emperor of Rome. His second reaction is fear, not of you, but of what this means for the stability of the empire. Because if the Empress can publicly mock imperial authority, if she can commit treason and invite half of Rome to witness it, then what does that say about imperial power? What does that say about Claudius himself? His third reaction is rage, the kind of cold, methodical rage that only comes when someone realizes they've been systematically betrayed by the person they trusted most. Claudius immediately returns to Rome with a force of Praetorian guards, moving faster than anyone thought his aging, limping body could manage. He's not just coming back to deal with an adultery scandal. He's coming back to prevent a potential coup, because that's what your marriage to Silius looks like from the outside, an attempt to replace the legitimate emperor with your new husband. It doesn't matter that you probably didn't intend it as treason. It doesn't matter that Silius is too stupid to actually pull off a successful rebellion. What matters is how it appears to the people who keep emperors in power, and it appears very much like you've just declared war on your own husband. Meanwhile, you and Silius are apparently so drunk on your own audacity that you don't immediately grasp the seriousness of the situation. You're still celebrating, still acting as if your marriage is some kind of clever political move rather than an act of spectacular self-destruction. It's only when the reports start coming in, Claudius is returning to Rome, he's brought soldiers, he's not stopping to negotiate, that you begin to understand what you've actually done. You haven't just broken the rules, you've threatened the foundation of imperial authority itself. And that's not the kind of thing emperors forgive, even when they love their wives, especially when they love their wives. What follows is less a trial and more a systematic extermination. Claudius doesn't bother with legal proceedings or formal charges. He simply issues orders, find everyone involved in the marriage ceremony, and kill them, all of them, immediately. The Praetorian guards fan out across Rome like a plague of armed locusts. They drag senators from their homes. They execute freedmen in the streets. They hunt down slaves who served as witnesses and cut them down without ceremony. Silius, your new husband and the supposed love of your life, is among the first to die. He doesn't even try to fight or flee. He just stands there as the guards approach, apparently still unable to believe that his marriage to the Empress could possibly have consequences. His last words, according to witnesses, are a confused protest that he's the Empress's husband now, that they can't execute him without proper legal proceedings. The guards execute him anyway. You, meanwhile, are in the imperial gardens when the killings begin. You can hear the screams from the city below, the sound of doors being smashed open, the cries of people who suddenly understand that being associated with your wedding was a death sentence. For the first time in your adult life, you experience genuine fear, not the playful anxiety of sexual adventure or the excitement of social scandal. Real fear, the bone-deep understanding that you've finally pushed things too far, and there's no way back. You try to flee the city, but where can the Empress of Rome hide? Every road is watched, every safe house is known to imperial agents, every potential ally is too terrified of Claudius's wrath to risk helping you, so you do the only thing left. You return to the palace and wait for your husband to come home. Claudius returns to the palace like a conquering general entering a defeated city. He spent the day methodically destroying everyone connected to your marriage, and now he's come for you. The meeting takes place in his private study, surrounded by the books and scrolls that have always been his refuge from the brutal realities of imperial politics. For a moment it's almost like old times, a husband and wife having a quiet conversation about their day, except that your day involved marrying another man, and his day involved ordering mass executions. Claudius doesn't shout, he doesn't rage, he simply looks at you with the expression of a man who has finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. Why? He asks. It's such a simple question, but you realize you don't have an answer, not a real one. Because how do you explain to someone that you destroyed your marriage, your position, and dozens of lives because you were bored? How do you tell the man who loved you, that his love was never enough to satisfy your appetites. You try seduction first, because it's always worked before. You approach him the way you've approached countless men over the years, with the kind of practiced charm that has turned emperors into fools and senators into slaves. But Claudius doesn't respond. He just watches you with the patient attention of a scholar studying an interesting but dangerous specimen. You try tears next, throwing yourself at his feet and begging for forgiveness. You promise to be faithful, to abandon your wild ways, to become the kind of wife he deserves. But you've made too many promises over the years and broken every one of them. Your words have no weight anymore. Finally, you try threats. You remind him of your family connections, your political allies, the chaos that might follow if he executes an empress without proper legal proceedings. And that's when Claudius smiles. It's not a pleasant smile. It's the smile of a man who has spent the last 6 hours proving that he's perfectly capable of executing anyone he chooses. Proper legal proceedings be damned. You seem to misunderstand something, he says quietly. I am not your husband anymore. You married Silius, remember? I am simply the Emperor of Rome dealing with a traitor. And with that he calls for the guards. Your execution is swift and private. Nothing like the spectacular public deaths that Claudius has ordered for your co-conspirators. No crowd gathers to watch. No speeches are made. No final words are recorded for posterity. You die in a garden pavilion, surrounded by the roses you once found so beautiful. The method is a sword thrust, delivered by a Praetorian officer, who performs his duty with the mechanical efficiency of a man following orders. Your last sight is probably the sky above Rome, the same sky you gazed at as a child when you dreamed of power and pleasure and freedom from consequences. Your body is buried quietly, without ceremony, in a tomb that bears no inscription describing your achievements or your scandals. Within a generation, even its location is forgotten. Claudius remarries within months, choosing a woman named Agrippina who will eventually poison him to death, which suggests that the emperor's taste in wives doesn't improve with experience. But that's another story for another time. Your name, however, lives on. Not as a celebration of female empowerment or sexual liberation, but as a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited appetite and absolutely no moral restraint. Within days of your death, Messalina becomes Rome's ultimate insult. To call a woman a Messalina is to suggest she's capable of any depravity, any betrayal, any act of sexual or moral corruption. It's worse than calling her a prostitute, because prostitutes at least have the excuse of necessity. You had everything and threw it all away for the sake of increasingly depraved thrills. But your story doesn't end with your death, because the damage you caused, the precedents you set, the boundaries you obliterated, they all outlive you. You've shown future imperial wives exactly how far they can push their husbands, exactly how much power they can accumulate, exactly how spectacularly they can self-destruct. More importantly, you've demonstrated something crucial about absolute power. It doesn't just corrupt the people who wield it, it corrupts everyone around them. Every senator who attended your bigamous wedding, every slave who facilitated your brothel visits, every citizen who whispered about your exploits, they all became complicit in your destruction of imperial dignity. And now, as your body cools in an unmarked grave, Rome has to figure out how to rebuild the very concept of imperial authority after you've spent 6 years systematically destroying it. The immediate aftermath of your execution is carefully managed by Claudius and his advisors. Official announcements are kept to a minimum. The Senate is told simply that the former empress committed treason and has been dealt with according to law. The details, they're informed, are not matters for public discussion. But Rome is a city that runs on gossip the way it runs on grain and olive oil. Within hours, everyone knows not just that you're dead, but how you died and why. The story spreads through the bathhouses, the forums, the taverns, growing more elaborate and shocking with each telling. Some versions have you dying heroically, defiant to the end. Others describe you as a coward, weeping and begging for mercy. A few creative storytellers claim you tried to seduce your executioner right up until the moment the sword pierced your heart. The truth, as usual, is probably more mundane than any of the legends. You likely died the way most people die when they finally run out of options, confused, frightened, and fundamentally unprepared for the reality that actions have consequences. But the legends matter more than the truth, because the legends are what shape how people remember you. And those legends all agree on one thing: you were dangerous, not just to yourself or your immediate family, but to the very foundations of Roman society. Your sexual exploits, outrageous as they were, might have been forgiven if they had remained private. Roman aristocrats have always been remarkably tolerant of sexual excess, as long as it doesn't threaten political stability. But you couldn't leave it at private excess. You had to make it public. You had to turn your appetites into weapons against the social order itself. The brothel competitions weren't just about sex. They were about proving that an empress could do anything a common prostitute could do, and do it better. The marriage to Silius wasn't just about love or lust. It was about demonstrating that imperial authority could be mocked, challenged, and ultimately ignored. You turned sexual deviance into political rebellion, and that's something Rome can never forgive or forget. The historians who write about you are not kind, but then again, you didn't give them much to work with in terms of redeeming qualities. Tacitus, writing decades after your death, describes you as a woman driven by shameless lust who made the palace a brothel. He doesn't waste time trying to understand your motivations or explain your behavior. As far as he's concerned, you're simply an example of what happens when women are given too much power and too little supervision. Pliny the Elder is even less charitable. He records your competition with Scylla not as an amusing anecdote, but as evidence of how far the imperial family had fallen from traditional Roman virtues. In his account, you're not a complex figure driven by psychological needs or political ambitions. You're just a cautionary tale about female sexuality run amok. Suetonius, who probably had access to imperial records that are now lost, provides the most detailed account of your crimes. But even he seems somewhat baffled by your behavior. He can catalogue what you did, but he struggles to explain why you did it. How do you analyze someone whose actions seem motivated by nothing more substantial than boredom and a complete lack of moral restraint? The problem the historians face is that your story doesn't fit into any of their usual categories. You're not a villain driven by political ambition, like Agrippina. You're not a victim of imperial politics like so many other imperial wives. You're not even a traditional example of female excess, because your excess was so extreme it transcended normal categories of vice. You're something new in Roman history, a woman who used absolute power not to achieve any particular goal, but simply to satisfy increasingly depraved appetites. You're not evil in any grand sense. You're just supremely, spectacularly selfish. And that perhaps is what makes you so memorable. Great villains have great motivations. They want to conquer the world, or revenge themselves on their enemies, or achieve some twisted vision of justice. You just wanted to have sex with as many people as possible, and never face any consequences for it. It's a remarkably small ambition for someone with such enormous power, and somehow that makes it even more disturbing. Modern psychologists who study your case usually reach for terms like nymphomania or sexual addiction, but those labels probably miss the point. Your behavior wasn't really about sex, any more than a glutton's behavior is really about food. What you were addicted to was transgression itself. The thrill of breaking rules, violating taboos, doing things that made other people gasp in horror. Sex was just the medium you chose for your rebellion against conventional morality. Consider the progression of your exploits. You started with simple adultery, which was common enough among Roman aristocrats to barely register as scandalous, but adultery quickly became boring, so you moved on to more elaborate affairs, more public indiscretions, more dangerous partners. When private affairs lost their thrill, you started visiting brothels. When brothel visits became routine, you started competing with professional prostitutes. When even that became mundane, you married your lover while still married to the emperor. Each escalation was designed to recapture the excitement of the previous transgression. You were like a drug addict, who needs increasingly larger doses to achieve the same high, except your drug was scandal, and your tolerance was apparently unlimited. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is how predictable your downfall was. Everyone around you could see where your behavior was leading. Your freedmen warned you. Your friends advised caution. Even some of your lovers tried to convince you to be more discreet. But you couldn't be discreet, because discretion would have defeated the entire purpose. The point wasn't just to have sexual adventures. The point was to prove that you could have sexual adventures and get away with it. The point was to demonstrate that you were above the rules that governed everyone else. And in a sense you were right. You did get away with it. For years, you committed adultery, frequented brothels, humiliated your husband, and faced no consequences whatsoever. Your mistake was thinking that immunity would last forever. You forgot that even emperors have limits. Even absolute power has boundaries. And when you finally found those boundaries, you discovered them in the most dramatic way possible. Your death doesn't end the chaos you created. In fact, it might make things worse, because now Claudius has to explain to the Roman people why their empress was executed for treason. He has to restore faith in imperial authority after his own wife made it a laughingstock. He has to prove that the imperial family deserves respect after you spent years demonstrating that imperial wives can be just as depraved as anyone else. The Senate, which has spent years carefully not noticing your behavior, suddenly has to acknowledge that they were all complicit in your scandals. Every senator who attended your parties, every magistrate who pretended not to hear the rumors, every official who helped cover up your more outrageous exploits, they all have to reconcile their silence with their supposed commitment to Roman virtue. The result is a kind of collective amnesia. Official records are sanitized. Witnesses are encouraged to forget what they saw. The details of your crimes are buried under layers of euphemism and misdirection. But the damage to imperial prestige is harder to repair. You've shown the Roman people that their rulers are not demigods descended from the heavens. They're just people with extraordinary power, and apparently no idea how to use it responsibly. This revelation has consequences that extend far beyond your immediate family. Future emperors will have to work harder to maintain their authority. Future empresses will be watched more carefully, trusted less completely. The easy assumption that imperial wives are paragons of Roman virtue is gone forever. You've also created a template for future scandals. Every subsequent imperial wife who steps out of line will be compared to you. Every adultery, every political intrigue, every hint of sexual impropriety will be measured against the Messalina standard. And since you set that standard so spectacularly high, most future scandals will seem almost quaint by comparison. You've made it virtually impossible for any future empress to shock Roman society the way you did, simply because you've already done everything shocking that anyone can imagine. In a perverse way, this might be your greatest achievement. You've created a legacy of such spectacular depravity that it will be remembered for centuries after your death. Not fondly, but remembered nonetheless. To understand how truly extraordinary your behavior was, it's important to remember the world you lived in. This wasn't a sexually repressed society. This wasn't a culture that had strict moral standards for everyone. Roman aristocrats regularly engaged in behavior that would scandalize modern conservatives. Homosexuality was common and accepted. Adultery was frequent and often overlooked. Orgies were standard entertainment at elite parties. Prostitution was legal and regulated. Even by these relaxed standards, your behavior was remarkable. You weren't just breaking rules that everyone broke anyway. You were obliterating boundaries that even the most debauched Romans recognized as necessary for social stability. The brothel competitions, for instance. Roman men visited prostitutes regularly, and nobody thought less of them for it. But Roman empresses weren't supposed to compete with prostitutes for customers. That crossed a line between private vice and public degradation. The marriage to Silius is even more telling. Romans understood political marriages, arranged marriages, loveless marriages. They also understood adultery as a natural consequence of marriages based on political necessity, rather than personal attraction. But bigamy, marrying your lover while remaining married to the emperor, that wasn't just adultery. It was a direct assault on the legal and religious foundations of Roman marriage. It suggested that imperial wives could simply ignore the laws that governed everyone else. And perhaps most damaging of all, you did everything publicly. Roman society could tolerate almost any private vice, but it required public virtue. You could sleep with anyone you wanted, as long as you maintained the appearance of imperial dignity. You could have as many lovers as you pleased, as long as you didn't humiliate your husband in front of the entire city. But you couldn't resist the temptation to make your vices public. You couldn't be content with private pleasures. You had to prove that you could violate every social norm and dare anyone to stop you. That's what made you dangerous, not your sexual appetite, but your determination to use that appetite as a weapon against the social order itself. Even among the notoriously dysfunctional Julio-Claudian dynasty, you stand out as uniquely destructive. Your predecessors and successors in the imperial family were certainly capable of spectacular scandals, but their scandals usually served some purpose beyond immediate gratification. Caligula's excesses, horrifying as they were partly calculated to intimidate his enemies and demonstrate his absolute power. His incest, his megalomania, his casual cruelty, they were all tools of political control, even if they were also expressions of mental illness. Agrippina, your successor as Claudius's wife, was certainly ruthless and manipulative. She poisoned her husband and maneuvered her son Nero into power through a series of calculated murders and political machinations. But her crimes were committed in service of a clear goal, securing imperial power for her bloodline. Even Nero, who would eventually become synonymous with imperial excess, used his cruelties and indulgences as methods of political control. His persecution of Christians, his murder of his mother, his burning of Rome, they were all expressions of imperial authority, however twisted. But your scandals served no political purpose. They advanced no agenda beyond your immediate pleasure. They secured no advantage for your family or your allies. They were pure self-indulgence, elevated to the level of state policy. Most people who achieve your level of notoriety do so because they're trying to accomplish something significant. Even if their methods are deplorable, you achieve notoriety simply by being spectacularly selfish. You had every advantage Roman society could offer: beauty, wealth, power, education, social position. You could have used these advantages to achieve almost anything. Instead, you used them to satisfy increasingly depraved appetites, until you finally pushed things so far that even your emperor husband had to stop you. It's a remarkably small use of remarkably large opportunities, and somehow that makes your story even more disturbing than the tales of emperors who used their power to conquer nations or persecute religious minorities. At least those emperors were trying to build something, even if what they built was monstrous. You were just trying to satisfy yourself, regardless of the cost to everyone around you. Your behavior didn't exist in a vacuum. It was enabled by a complex network of servants, freedmen, guards, and aristocrats who all participated in your scandals to various degrees, and their participation reveals something troubling about the nature of imperial power. Prabatake. Consider the slaves who arranged your brothel visits. They knew they were helping the empress commit adultery and humiliate the emperor, but they also knew that refusing your orders would probably result in their death. So they chose complicity over martyrdom, which is understandable but morally questionable. Consider the aristocrats who attended your bigamous wedding. They knew they were witnessing treason. They knew that marriage ceremony had no legal validity and enormous political implications. But they also knew that staying away might be interpreted as disloyalty to the imperial family. Consider the Praetorian guards who eventually executed you. They had spent years protecting you, escorting you to brothels, standing watch while you committed adultery. They knew exactly what kind of person you were, but they followed orders when those orders came from the emperor rather than the empress. What all of these people had in common was a willingness to compromise their own moral standards in exchange for imperial favor or imperial protection. They enabled your behavior not because they approved of it, but because opposing it seemed more dangerous than tolerating it. This reveals something crucial about absolute power. it doesn't just corrupt the people who wield it. It corrupts everyone who comes into contact with it. Your scandals were only possible because dozens of people chose to look the other way, to follow orders, to prioritize their own safety over their moral convictions. In a sense, your story is not just about one woman's spectacular self-destruction. It's about an entire system that allows one person's appetites to override everyone else's judgment. It's about what happens when power becomes so concentrated that normal social checks and balances simply stop functioning. You didn't destroy yourself in isolation. You destroyed yourself with the active assistance of a society that was too intimidated, too corrupted, or too invested in imperial authority to stop you. Fribe of politic. Your story also reveals the complex and contradictory nature of female power in imperial Rome. On one hand, you had access to privileges and opportunities that would have been unimaginable for most women in the ancient world. You could travel freely, control vast wealth, influence political decisions, and associate with anyone you chose. On the other hand, your power was entirely derivative. It came from your relationship to the emperor, not from any independent source of authority. You were powerful because you were Claudius's wife, not because you were Valeria Messalina. This created a strange dynamic where you had enormous freedom to act, but only as long as your actions didn't threaten the source of your power. You could sleep with anyone you wanted, as long as you didn't humiliate Claudius too publicly. You could influence politics, as long as you didn't challenge imperial authority directly. Your tragedy, if we can call it that, is that you never understood these limitations. You acted as if your power was absolute and independent, when it was actually conditional and borrowed. You pushed the boundaries of what an imperial wife could do until you finally found the boundary that couldn't be crossed. The irony is that if you had been slightly more careful, slightly more discreet, you might have gotten away with almost anything. Roman society was remarkably tolerant of female excess, as long as it remained private. Even your husband was apparently willing to overlook considerable indiscretions, as long as they didn't threaten his own authority. But you couldn't be satisfied with private excess. You needed public recognition of your transgressions. You needed everyone to know that you were above the rules that governed other women, and that need for public acknowledgement is what ultimately destroyed you. In a way, your story is a perfect illustration of the limits of female power in a patriarchal society. You could have enormous freedom within certain boundaries, but crossing those boundaries meant immediate and total destruction. Your story also has religious implications that are often overlooked. Roman religion was deeply concerned with maintaining proper relationships between mortals and gods, and your behavior violated several fundamental religious principles. Marriage, in Roman belief, was not just a legal contract, but a sacred bond overseen by the gods. By marrying Silius while still married to Claudius, you didn't just commit bigamy, you committed sacrilege, violating the religious foundations of Roman society. Your sexual behavior was also religiously problematic. Roman religion acknowledged and even celebrated sexuality, but it insisted that sexual activity should be properly channeled and socially constructive. Your random, excessive public sexuality served no religious or social purpose. Most seriously, your behavior violated the principle of imperial dignity, which had quasi-religious significance. The emperor and his family were not quite gods, but they were more than ordinary mortals. They were expected to embody Roman virtues and serve as moral examples for the rest of society. By turning the imperial palace into what Tacitus called a brothel, you desecrated the sacred space of imperial authority. You turned the center of Roman government into a site of religious pollution. This religious dimension of your crimes helps explain why your punishment was so swift and absolute. Claudius wasn't just dealing with an adultery scandal. He was dealing with a fundamental challenge to the religious foundations of imperial authority. Your execution in this context was not just political necessity, but religious obligation. The gods required the pollution you had created to be cleansed, and the only way to accomplish that cleansing was through your death. This religious interpretation of your story would have been obvious to contemporary Romans, even if it's often missed by modern historians. Your contemporaries didn't just see you as a sexually promiscuous woman, they saw you as someone who had violated the sacred order of the universe and needed to be eliminated to restore cosmic balance. Your story becomes a template for literary depictions of female villainy that persists for centuries. Authors from Tacitus to Shakespeare to modern novelists use you as a shorthand for uncontrolled female sexuality and its destructive potential. But these literary treatments often miss the complexity of your actual story. They focus on the sensational details of your sexual exploits, while ignoring the political and social context that made those exploits possible. In most literary versions, you become a simple cautionary tale about lust and power. You're reduced to a one-dimensional character whose only motivation is sexual appetite. The real complexity of your situation, the pressures of imperial life, the corrupting influence of absolute power, the lack of meaningful outlets for female ambition, gets lost in the focus on scandalous behavior. This literary simplification does a disservice to the historical record, but it serves an important cultural function. Your story becomes a way for later societies to explore their own anxieties about female power and sexuality, without having to confront the complexities of real women's lives. The fictional Messalina is easier to understand and condemn than the historical Messalina. The fictional version is pure evil, motivated by nothing but lust and cruelty. The historical version is more disturbing because she's more human, a woman who made increasingly destructive choices without any grand evil plan. The literary treatments also tend to focus on your sexuality, while ignoring your political activities. But your real crime wasn't sexual promiscuity. It was using your sexual behavior as a weapon against imperial authority. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about how societies process female transgression. It's easier to condemn women for sexual misconduct than to acknowledge that they might be capable of political rebellion. By focusing on your sex life, later authors could avoid confronting the possibility that you were actually challenging the political system itself. They could treat you as a personal failure rather than a systemic problem. Understanding your story requires careful attention to the sources because most of what we know about you comes from historians who had their own agendas and biases. Tacitus, our most detailed source, was writing during the reign of Trajan, when the imperial family was trying to distance itself from the excesses of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His account of your behavior serves partly as a contrast to the supposed virtue of later emperors and empresses. Suetonius was primarily interested in entertaining his readers with scandalous stories about previous emperors. His account of your crimes is detailed and vivid, but it's unclear how much of it is based on reliable evidence, and how much is based on rumor and gossip. Pliny the Elder was a contemporary who might have had access to first-hand accounts, but his writing is heavily influenced by traditional Roman moral values. He sees your story primarily as an example of what happens when women abandon traditional virtue. The problem is that none of these sources are particularly interested in understanding your motivations or analyzing the systemic factors that enabled your behavior. They're primarily concerned with using your story to make points about imperial virtue, female nature, or social morality. This makes it difficult to separate fact from propaganda in their accounts. We know that you committed adultery, frequented brothels, and married Silius while still married to Claudius. These facts are confirmed by multiple sources and seem historically reliable. But the details of your sexual exploits, the specific numbers of partners, the exact nature of your competitions with prostitutes, these details come from sources that had political and moral reasons to exaggerate your crimes. Modern historians have to navigate carefully between accepting the broad outline of your story while remaining skeptical about the more sensational details. The challenge is to understand what your behavior reveals about imperial society without simply repeating the moral judgments of ancient authors. The final months of your life after your marriage to Silius but before your execution reveal the full extent of your miscalculation. You seem to have genuinely believed that your position as empress made you untouchable, even after committing what amounted to public treason. According to the sources, you spent your last weeks acting as if your marriage to Silius had somehow legitimized his claim to imperial authority. You held court, received petitioners, and issued what amounted to imperial orders. You behaved, in other words, as if you had successfully engineered a change of government. This suggests either remarkable political naivety or complete detachment from reality? Did you really think that marrying your lover would somehow transfer imperial authority from your husband to your new spouse? Did you imagine that the Praetorian Guard would simply accept Silius as their new emperor because you had performed a marriage ceremony? Or were you simply so accustomed to getting your way, so used to having your desires treated as commands that you couldn't imagine anyone successfully opposing you? The historical record suggests you were genuinely surprised by Claudius's swift and violent response to your marriage. You apparently expected negotiation, compromise, perhaps some kind of arrangement that would allow you to maintain your position while acknowledging your new relationship. Instead, you discovered that even imperial patience has limits. Even the most tolerant husband will eventually reach a point where tolerance becomes impossible. Even absolute power cannot survive the complete abandonment of all pretense of legitimacy. Your final mistake was treating imperial authority as if it were a game rather than a matter of life and death. You forgot that emperors stay in power not through the consent of their wives but through the loyalty of their armies. When you forced Claudius to choose between his love for you and his hold on imperial power, you made the choice easy for him. An emperor who cannot control his own household cannot hope to control an empire. Your death was not just the punishment for your crimes. It was the inevitable result of your fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually works. As we reach the end of your story, it's worth considering what you actually accomplished with your life. You had every advantage Roman society could offer. You were beautiful, wealthy, well-connected, and married to the most powerful man in the world. You could have used these advantages to advance any number of worthy causes. You could have patronized artists, supported public works, championed the rights of slaves or women. You could have used your influence to promote peace, prosperity, or social justice. Instead, you used your advantages to satisfy your own appetites at the expense of everyone around you. You turned the imperial palace into a center of scandal and corruption. You humiliated your husband, corrupted Roman youth, and ultimately destabilized the very foundations of imperial authority. Your legacy is not one of female empowerment or sexual liberation. It's a legacy of waste, destruction, and moral bankruptcy. You took every gift life offered you, and used them for purposes that benefited no one except yourself. Even your sexual adventures, which might be seen as expressions of personal freedom, were actually exercises in coercion and exploitation. You used your power to force people into sexual relationships they couldn't refuse. You turned pleasure into a weapon and seduction into a form of tyranny. Your story is not a tragedy in the classical sense, because tragedy requires a fundamentally sympathetic character who is destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. You are not sympathetic, and your destruction was entirely self-inflicted. You are not a victim of patriarchal oppression, because you had more freedom and power than almost any woman in the ancient world. You are not a victim of political intrigue, because your downfall was the direct result of your own choices. You are simply someone who was given everything and chose to use it badly. Someone who confused freedom with license, power with immunity, and desire with right. In the end, your story serves as a perfect illustration of what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited appetite, and absolutely no moral restraint. It's a cautionary tale about the corruption of privilege and the dangers of treating other people as objects for personal gratification. You lived as if consequences were for other people, until the day you discovered they applied to you as well. You treated imperial dignity as if it were a game, until you learned that some games have permanent stakes. And now, nearly 2,000 years after your death, your name remains synonymous with everything that can go wrong when power is placed in the hands of someone who lacks the wisdom, restraint, and basic human decency to use it responsibly. Valeria Messalina, empress, adulteress, bigamist, traitor, and ultimately, a perfect example of how spectacular advantages can lead to even more spectacular failures. Your story ends not with redemption or understanding, but with the simple recognition that some people, given every opportunity to be better, choose instead to be worse. And sometimes, those choices have consequences that echo through history long after the people who made them are nothing but dust and cautionary tales. The brothel competitions, the public humiliations, the marriage scandal, they all fade into historical footnotes. What remains is the lesson that power without virtue is not just dangerous to its possessors, but to everyone unfortunate enough to live within its reach. And that lesson perhaps is the only lasting contribution you made to human civilization, not through your life but through your death, not through your achievements but through your failures, not as an example to follow, but as a warning to heed. In the end, that may be the most fitting legacy for someone who spent her life proving that it's possible to have everything and still accomplish nothing worthwhile at all. But your death, swift as it was, didn't immediately solve all the problems you created. If anything, it made some of them worse, because now Claudius had to explain to a shocked Roman populace why their empress had been executed without a public trial, without formal charges, without any of the legal niceties that supposedly distinguished Roman justice from barbarian vengeance. The official story, carefully crafted by imperial advisors, was simple. Messalina had committed treason by marrying another man while still wed to the emperor. This violated both Roman law and religious tradition. The punishment was swift, because the crime was clear and the evidence undeniable. But the unofficial story, the one whispered in taverns and bathhouses across the city, was far more complex and disturbing. People wanted to know details. How long had the empress been unfaithful? How many men had she seduced? Was it true she had competed with prostitutes? Had she really held orgies in the imperial palace? These questions couldn't be answered officially, without making the imperial family look even worse than they already did. So they were answered unofficially, through rumors and gossip that grew more elaborate and shocking with each retelling. Within months you had become a legend of depravity that exceeded even the reality of your behavior. Stories circulated claiming you had slept with entire legions, that you had forced senators' wives to participate in your orgies, that you had tried to auction off government positions to the highest bidders. Some of these stories were probably true, many were certainly false. All of them served the same purpose. They allowed Roman society to process the shock of learning that their empress had been a sexual predator who used imperial power to satisfy her increasingly depraved appetites. These were people who had spent years pretending not to notice your behavior, who had attended your parties and accepted your invitations despite knowing exactly what kind of person you were. Now they had to reconcile their complicity with their supposed commitment to Roman virtue. Some dealt with this cognitive dissonance by claiming they had always suspected you were dangerous but were powerless to act. Others insisted they had no idea how far your behavior had gone. A few brave souls admitted they had known but had been too intimidated by imperial power to speak out. But most simply pretended the whole thing had never happened. They developed a collective amnesia about the previous 6 years, acting as if Claudius had been married to someone else entirely. It was easier to forget than to acknowledge their own moral cowardice. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers responsible for protecting the imperial family, faced their own reckoning after your death. These were men who had spent years escorting you to brothels, standing watch while you committed adultery, and generally facilitating behavior they knew was treasonous. Their situation was particularly delicate because they served at the pleasure of the emperor, but their daily orders often came from the empress. When those two authorities conflicted, which loyalty took precedence, during your lifetime, most guards resolved this dilemma by following your orders while hoping Claudius would never find out. They told themselves they were protecting imperial unity by keeping your scandals secret. They convinced themselves that preventing a public crisis was more important than preventing private vice. But they had enabled behavior that ultimately threatened the stability of the empire itself. Their silence and complicity had allowed you to escalate your transgressions until they became impossible to ignore or forgive. Some guards dealt with this guilt by claiming they had been following orders and had no choice in the matter. Others insisted they had tried to discourage your more outrageous behavior, but had been overruled. A few admitted they had enjoyed the excitement and chaos you brought to what was normally a boring job. But all of them learned a crucial lesson about the nature of imperial service. Sometimes protecting the emperor means stopping the empress, even when she outranks you in the imperial hierarchy. Sometimes loyalty to the office requires betrayal of the person who currently holds it. This lesson would prove valuable in future reigns, when other imperial wives would test the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The guards who survived your purge became the institutional memory of what happens when empresses are allowed to operate without constraints. They passed down stories, warnings and procedures designed to prevent future Messalinas from using imperial authority to facilitate personal depravity. In a sense, your death created the first systematic approach to controlling imperial wives who might be tempted to abuse their positions. The Roman Senate's response to your downfall revealed the complex relationship between imperial power and traditional republican institutions. Senators had watched your behavior for years, knowing it violated every principle they claimed to hold sacred, but feeling powerless to intervene. Now that you were dead, they faced a delicate political challenge. They needed to restore faith in imperial authority without appearing to criticize Claudius for failing to control his wife. They needed to condemn your behavior without acknowledging their own complicity in covering it up. The solution they adopted was typically Roman in its complexity and hypocrisy. They passed a series of laws strengthening the penalties for adultery and bigamy, as if legal reforms could somehow prevent future empresses from following your example. They held public ceremonies praising traditional Roman virtues, as if ritual declarations could erase the memory of your scandals. Most importantly, they began the process of what modern historians call damnatio memoria, the systematic erasure of your name and accomplishments from official records. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were chiseled away, documents were edited to remove references to your existence. This wasn't just spite or political revenge. It was a desperate attempt to restore the dignity of imperial office by pretending that your marriage to Claudius had never happened. If your name could be forgotten, perhaps the damage you had done to imperial prestige could be forgotten as well. But erasure is never complete, especially when the crimes being erased are as spectacular as yours. Despite official efforts to forget you, your story survived in private letters, personal memoirs, and the kind of underground literature that thrives when official sources are censored. The Senate's attempt to delete you from history actually ensured that you would be remembered, because when authorities try to suppress a story, people become more interested in preserving it. Your scandals became the kind of forbidden knowledge that gets passed down through generations precisely because it's forbidden. In trying to protect imperial dignity by forgetting you, the Senate inadvertently guaranteed that you would be remembered as the empress so scandalous that even Rome tried to pretend she had never existed. News of your execution traveled slowly throughout the Roman Empire, carried by merchants, soldiers, and official messengers to provinces that had heard rumors about the empress but knew few details about her actual behavior. The reactions in different parts of the empire revealed interesting cultural differences in how sexual scandals were understood and processed. In Greek-speaking provinces, where sexuality was often viewed more openly, your behavior was seen as politically dangerous but not necessarily morally shocking. In more conservative regions, particularly those with strong traditional values, your story was received with a mixture of horror and fascination. These were communities where female chastity was considered essential to social order, and the idea of an empress behaving like a prostitute was almost incomprehensible. In frontier provinces, where Roman authority was still being established, your scandals posed a particular problem. Local populations who were still deciding whether to accept Roman rule might interpret imperial sexual chaos as evidence that Romans were unfit to govern anyone, including themselves. Provincial governors found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain why the wife of their supreme leader had been executed for treason. They needed to maintain respect for imperial authority while acknowledging that the imperial family was capable of spectacular moral failures. Some governors dealt with this challenge by emphasizing Claudius's swift response to your crimes. They portrayed your execution as proof that Roman justice applied even to the most powerful women in the empire. No one, they argued, was above the law. Others took a different approach, focusing on your behavior as an aberration rather than a reflection of Roman values. They presented you as an individual moral failure rather than a systematic problem with imperial governance. But in all cases, provincial authorities had to confront the reality that imperial prestige had been seriously damaged by your actions. The idea that Roman emperors were divinely chosen leaders became harder to maintain when everyone knew the previous empress had spent her time competing with prostitutes in public brothels. Your death created significant challenges for Roman religious authorities, who had to figure out how to purify the sacred spaces you had polluted with your behavior. The imperial palace, various temples where you had worshipped, and even the brothels you had frequented all required ritual cleansing. Roman religion was deeply concerned with maintaining proper relationships between the human and divine worlds. Your violations of marriage law, your public sexual competitions, and your mockery of imperial dignity had all created what religious authorities called pollution, a kind of spiritual contamination that could spread if not properly addressed. The solution involved elaborate purification rituals conducted by professional priests at considerable expense to the imperial treasury. Sacred spaces had to be reconsecrated, protective deities had to be appeased, and special sacrifices had to be offered to restore the cosmic balance you had disrupted. But the religious complications went beyond mere ritual purification. Your behavior had raised fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial authority and divine approval. If the gods had chosen Claudius to rule Rome, why had they allowed his wife to behave so abominably? Some priests argued that your behavior was a test of imperial virtue, and Claudius had passed by executing you swiftly. Others suggested that your crimes were divine punishment for some unnamed imperial transgression that required additional atonement. A few brave religious authorities pointed out that your behavior might indicate that the gods were withdrawing their support from the Julio-Claudian dynasty entirely. This was a dangerous suggestion that could be interpreted as treason, but it reflected genuine concern about the spiritual implications of your scandals. The religious establishment ultimately settled on a compromise interpretation. You had been possessed by evil spirits or foreign deities that had corrupted your natural Roman virtue. This explanation allowed them to condemn your behavior while maintaining that true Roman women, properly protected by traditional gods, would never behave as you had. This supernatural explanation for your crimes became popular because it relieved everyone else of responsibility for enabling your behavior. Your servants, your guards, your party guests, they had all been deceived by malevolent spiritual forces, not corrupted by their own moral weakness. Your scandals had economic as well as political and religious consequences. The imperial household you had managed was responsible for enormous expenditures, and your particular interests had created some unusual budget items that now required explanation. The palace accounts revealed payments to brothel owners, gifts to prostitutes, bribes to silence witnesses, and various other expenses related to facilitating and concealing your sexual adventures. These expenditures had been funded by the imperial treasury, which meant that Roman taxpayers had unknowingly subsidized your competitions with professional sex workers. There were also the costs associated with your parties and entertainments. While imperial hospitality was expected and politically necessary, your gatherings had apparently featured entertainment that was both expensive and inappropriate. Professional performers, exotic foods, rare wines, all purchased to create the kind of atmosphere that would encourage your guests to participate in activities they might normally avoid. The financial investigation revealed a pattern of escalating expenses that mirrored the escalation of your sexual behavior. As your appetites became more extreme, the costs of satisfying them increased correspondingly. What had started as relatively modest expenditures for private pleasures had grown into a major drain on imperial resources. More seriously, your behavior had created liability issues that would persist long after your death. People who had been coerced into sexual relationships with you might demand compensation. Families whose members had been corrupted by association with your court might seek damages. Property owners whose establishments had been used for your activities might claim they deserved payment for the risks they had undertaken. Claudius's legal advisors spent months trying to calculate the potential financial exposure created by your behavior. They ultimately decided that the safest approach was to offer generous settlements to anyone who might have a legitimate claim, regardless of the cost. The economic legacy of your reign as empress was thus a substantial debt that had to be paid by your successor, and ultimately by the Roman people. You had managed to convert imperial resources into personal pleasure with remarkable efficiency, leaving behind nothing of value except cautionary tales and unpaid bills. Foreign rulers who had dealings with the Roman Empire found themselves in the awkward position of having to pretend they hadn't heard the stories about the emperor's wife. Diplomatic protocols required that foreign ambassadors show proper respect to imperial family members. But how do you show respect to an empress who has publicly competed with prostitutes? How do you maintain normal diplomatic relations when everyone knows the emperor's wife has committed bigamy? Some foreign rulers used your scandals as propaganda weapons against Roman influence in their regions. They argued that Romans who couldn't control their own wives were hardly qualified to govern foreign territories. They pointed to your behavior as evidence that Roman claims of moral superiority were hypocritical nonsense. Others saw your downfall as an opportunity to improve their relationships with Rome by offering public support for Claudius's decision to execute you. They sent formal messages praising Roman justice and expressing confidence that imperial authority had been restored through your death. The most sophisticated foreign observers recognized that your scandals represented a systemic problem rather than an individual failure. They began to question whether the Roman imperial system was inherently unstable, prone to the kind of moral and political chaos you had created. These diplomatic complications persisted long after your death. Because international relationships are built on perceptions of stability and reliability, your behavior had damaged Rome's reputation for both, and restoring that reputation required years of careful diplomatic work by Claudius and his successors. Foreign courts that had previously treated Rome with automatic respect now watched imperial behavior more carefully, looking for signs of weakness or instability. Your legacy included a more skeptical international environment, where Roman claims of authority were subjected to closer scrutiny. Perhaps most significantly, your story marked a turning point in Roman attitudes toward imperial wives and female power more generally. Before your reign, Roman society had been relatively tolerant of powerful women, recognizing that imperial wives naturally acquired influence through their relationships with emperors. But your spectacular abuse of that influence created a backlash against female power that would persist for generations. Future imperial wives would find themselves subject to much closer scrutiny and much stricter limitations on their behavior. The cultural shift was reflected in everything from literature to law to social customs. Writers began depicting powerful women as inherently dangerous and untrustworthy. Legislators passed laws restricting female financial and legal independence. Social leaders promoted traditional values that emphasized female subordination and domestic virtue. This backlash wasn't entirely fair, because you were an extreme case rather than a typical example of female behavior, but your extremism made it easy for critics of female power to argue that women couldn't be trusted with authority, because they inevitably abused it for personal gratification. The cultural transformation also affected how Romans understood the relationship between sexuality and power. Your story became a template for arguments that sexual freedom inevitably led to political chaos, that personal morality was inseparable from public virtue. These ideas would influence Roman culture for centuries, creating a more restrictive environment for both women and sexuality in general. Your legacy thus extended far beyond your immediate political impact to shape fundamental attitudes about gender, power, and moral behavior. The irony is that you probably didn't intend to create this cultural transformation. You were focused on satisfying your immediate desires, not on making grand statements about female power or sexual liberation. But your behavior was so extreme that it forced Roman society to reconsider its basic assumptions about what women could be trusted to do. Your story also left a lasting psychological impact on Roman consciousness that extended far beyond the immediate political and cultural effects. You had forced an entire civilization to confront uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and human nature. The psychological trauma wasn't limited to the people who had direct contact with you. It extended to ordinary Romans who had to reconcile their beliefs about imperial virtue with the reality of your behavior. How do you maintain faith in divine authority when the emperor's wife has been publicly competing with prostitutes? Some people dealt with this cognitive dissonance by developing more cynical attitudes toward authority in general. If the imperial family could be so corrupt, what did that say about other powerful institutions? If the empress could be so depraved, how could anyone be trusted with power? Others responded by becoming more rigid in their moral expectations, demanding higher standards of behavior from public figures as compensation for your failures. They created impossibly strict codes of conduct that future imperial wives would struggle to meet. But perhaps the most significant psychological impact was the way your story changed how Romans thought about the relationship between private virtue and public authority. Before your reign, it had been possible to separate personal morality from political effectiveness. After your downfall, that separation became much more difficult to maintain. Your behavior had demonstrated that private vice could have public consequences, that personal corruption could threaten political stability. This insight would influence Roman political thinking for generations, creating expectations that public figures would be morally exemplary in their private lives as well as their professional duties. The psychological legacy of your reign was thus a more anxious, suspicious, and morally demanding political culture. Romans became less trusting of their leaders and more insistent on moral purity as a qualification for power. As we reach the true end of your story, looking back across the wreckage you created and the centuries of consequences that followed, what final judgment can we render on the life and legacy of Valeria Messalina? You were, without question, one of the most sexually voracious individuals in recorded history. Your appetites were extraordinary, even by the standards of a society that was remarkably tolerant of sexual excess. Your willingness to act on those appetites regardless of social conventions or political consequences was unprecedented. But sexual appetite alone doesn't explain the lasting fascination with your story. Plenty of historical figures have been promiscuous without achieving your level of notoriety. What made you unique was your systematic use of imperial power to facilitate and publicize your sexual adventures. You turned the empress's traditional role as moral exemplar into its exact opposite, using your position to violate every standard of feminine virtue that Roman society valued. You transformed imperial dignity into imperial degradation with a thoroughness that impressed even your harshest critics. Your political impact was equally destructive. You forced a fundamental reconsideration of imperial authority by demonstrating that even the emperor's wife could openly mock imperial dignity without immediate consequences. You showed that power without virtue was not just personally corrupting but politically dangerous. Your religious impact was perhaps most lasting of all. You forced Roman society to confront the possibility that their gods might not protect them from moral corruption, even at the highest levels of society. This religious anxiety would influence Roman culture long after your death. Your cultural legacy was a more restrictive, suspicious, and morally demanding society that reacted to your extremism by imposing stricter limitations on female power and sexual expression. You didn't liberate Roman women. You provided ammunition for arguments that women needed to be more carefully controlled. Your economic impact was substantial but temporary. The debts you created were eventually paid. The expenses you incurred were ultimately absorbed by the imperial treasury, but the precedent you set for using public resources for private pleasure would influence how future emperors and empresses managed imperial finances. Your diplomatic legacy was a damaged reputation for Roman reliability and moral authority that required years to repair. Foreign rulers who had previously treated Rome with automatic respect began to question whether Romans were capable of governing themselves, let alone others. Your psychological legacy was perhaps most profound. You created lasting anxiety about the relationship between power and virtue that would influence Roman political culture for generations. You forced an entire civilization to confront uncomfortable truths about what people will do when they have unlimited power and no moral constraints. But perhaps your most significant legacy was simply the story itself, a perfect cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited appetite meets unlimited power and absolutely no moral restraint. Your story became a template for understanding corruption, a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, and a reminder that even the most privileged people can destroy themselves through their own choices. In the end, you achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind anyone would want. You're remembered not for anything you built or created or accomplished, but for the spectacular completeness of your self-destruction. You had every advantage human society could offer, and you used them all in service of increasingly depraved pleasures until you finally crossed a line that even imperial power couldn't protect you from crossing. Valeria Messalina, a woman who proved that it's possible to have everything and still accomplish nothing except providing future generations with a perfect example of how not to live. Your story ends where it began, with the recognition that some people, given every opportunity to be better, choose instead to be spectacularly, memorably, cautionary worse. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy of all for someone who spent her entire adult life proving that absolute power, absolute freedom, and absolute indulgence are a combination that inevitably leads to absolute destruction. But your story doesn't end with your death or even with the immediate aftermath. The consequences of your behavior rippled through Roman society for generations, affecting people who were born long after your execution, but who still lived in the shadow of the precedents you set. Consider the fate of future imperial wives. Every woman who married into the imperial family after your death had to navigate a political landscape fundamentally altered by your scandals. They faced suspicion, scrutiny, and restrictions that previous empresses had never encountered. Agrippina, who married Claudius just months after your execution, inherited not just your position, but your reputation. She had to prove that she was everything you weren't: virtuous, loyal, politically astute, rather than sexually voracious. The irony, of course, is that Agrippina eventually poisoned Claudius to secure power for her son Nero, proving that imperial wives could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with sexual appetite. But even Agrippina's political machinations were partly a response to the constraints placed on imperial wives because of your behavior. She couldn't rely on the traditional soft power that previous empresses had wielded through social influence and cultural patronage. Those avenues had been closed off by the backlash against your scandals. Instead, she had to pursue power through more direct and ultimately more destructive methods. In a sense, your sexual crimes created the conditions that made Agrippina's political crimes inevitable. The pattern continued through subsequent generations. Imperial wives found themselves caught between competing expectations. They needed to be influential enough to support their husbands' reigns, but not so influential that they appeared to be challenging male authority. They needed to be morally exemplary, but not so perfect that they seemed artificial or manipulative. These impossible expectations created a no-win situation that contributed to the instability of later imperial families. Women who tried to be traditionally virtuous were dismissed as weak and ineffective. Women who showed any initiative or independence were immediately compared to you and condemned as potential threats to imperial stability. Your legacy thus created a destructive cycle, where imperial wives were simultaneously expected to be powerful and powerless, influential and invisible, perfect and human. The psychological pressure of these contradictory demands drove some to madness, others to desperate political schemes, and still others to the kind of withdrawn passivity that made them useless as partners in imperial governance. Your scandals also forced permanent changes in the institutional structure of imperial government. The systems that had allowed you to operate without effective oversight were recognized as dangerous vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. New protocols were established for monitoring the activities of imperial family members. The Praetorian Guard was given explicit authority to report suspicious behavior directly to the emperor, even when that behavior involved the empress. Palace servants were organized into overlapping networks of surveillance that made it much harder for future imperial wives to conduct secret activities. Financial controls were tightened to prevent imperial resources from being diverted to inappropriate purposes. Expenditures that had been routine during your reign, payments to entertainers, gifts to questionable associates, expenses for private parties, now required explicit imperial approval and detailed justification. Religious authorities were given enhanced roles in supervising imperial family behavior. Regular ceremonies were instituted to reinforce the sacred nature of imperial marriage and the religious obligations of imperial wives. These weren't just empty rituals. They were designed to create public accountability for private behavior. Legal reforms were enacted to clarify the penalties for imperial adultery and to establish procedures for dealing with treasonous behavior by family members. Previous laws had been vague about how to handle situations like yours, partly because no one had imagined that an empress would behave as you did. The new institutional arrangements were designed to prevent future Messalinas, but they also created their own problems. The surveillance systems that monitored imperial wives for signs of sexual impropriety could also be used to spy on political activities. The financial controls that prevented misuse of imperial resources also limited the ability of empresses to pursue legitimate political and cultural initiatives. Most significantly, the religious oversight that was meant to ensure moral behavior also gave priests unprecedented influence over imperial family decisions. This religious involvement in imperial governance would have consequences that extended far beyond questions of sexual morality. Your scandals thus led to institutional changes that altered the fundamental structure of Roman government. The informal, personality-based system that had allowed you to operate without constraint was replaced by formal bureaucratic controls that limited the freedom of all future imperial family members. The way writers and historians treated your story also evolved over time, reflecting changing attitudes towards sexuality, power, and female agency. The earliest accounts, written by contemporaries like Tacitus and Pliny, focus primarily on the moral dimensions of your behavior. These early writers were primarily concerned with using your story to illustrate traditional Roman virtues. By contrast, they presented you as an example of what happened when women abandoned the moral constraints that held society together. Their accounts were detailed but morally simplistic. You were evil, your behavior was inexcusable, and your death was both inevitable and deserved. Later Roman writers, writing after the initial shock of your scandals had faded, began to explore the political dimensions of your story more deeply. They recognized that your behavior had been enabled by systemic problems in imperial governance, not just personal moral failings. These later accounts still condemned your behavior, but they also acknowledged that you had been operating within a system that provided few constraints on imperial power. They began to ask uncomfortable questions about whether absolute power inevitably led to absolute corruption, regardless of the personal character of the people who wielded it. Medieval writers, influenced by Christian moral theology, transformed your story into a cautionary tale about the dangers of lust and pride. They were less interested in the political context of your behavior than in its spiritual implications. You became a symbol of fallen humanity, proof that even the most privileged people could be corrupted by sin. Renaissance writers rediscovered the political complexity of your story, using it to explore questions about the relationship between personal virtue and public authority that were relevant to their own times. They recognized that your scandals had raised fundamental questions about the nature of legitimate government that hadn't been fully resolved. Modern historians have tried to approach your story with greater analytical rigor, attempting to separate fact from propaganda and to understand your behavior within its proper historical context. But even modern accounts struggle with the basic problem that your actions were so extreme they resist rational explanation. The evolution of literary treatments of your story thus reflects broader changes in how societies understand the relationship between individual behavior and social structure. Your scandals continue to serve as a lens through which different eras examine their own assumptions about power, morality, and human nature. Modern psychologists and psychiatrists have been fascinated by your case, seeing it as an extreme example of several psychological phenomena that are still studied today. Your behavior exhibits patterns that are now recognized as characteristic of certain personality disorders, though obviously no clinical diagnosis can be made across such temporal distance. Some analysts focus on what appears to be your complete lack of empathy for the people you exploited, your sexual partners, your political victims. Even your own family members seem to have been viewed as objects for your gratification, rather than as human beings with their own rights and feelings. This suggests what modern psychology would classify as severe narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by grandiose self-perception, a sense of entitlement, and an inability to recognize or care about the impact of one's behavior on others. Your conviction that normal rules didn't apply to you is a classic symptom of this condition. Other researchers focus on what appears to be addictive behavior patterns in your sexual activities. The escalating nature of your transgressions, from simple adultery to public competitions to bigamous marriage, suggests someone who needed increasingly extreme stimulation to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. This pattern is consistent with modern understanding of behavioral addictions, where individuals become psychologically dependent on specific activities and require ever more intense experiences to maintain their emotional equilibrium. Your sexual behavior may have been less about physical pleasure than about the psychological rush of transgression and control. Still, other analysts examine your story as an example of how unlimited power can corrupt psychological development. They argue that your behavior reflects what happens when someone is never forced to develop normal restraint mechanisms because they face no meaningful consequences for their actions. This perspective suggests that your crimes were partly the product of your environment rather than purely the result of inherent psychological flaws. Anyone raised with absolute power and no accountability might develop similar patterns of behavior regardless of their original moral character. The psychological dimension of your story adds complexity to moral judgments about your behavior. While it doesn't excuse or justify your crimes, it does suggest that they may have been partly the product of circumstances that were beyond your control. Historians have also found your story useful for comparative analysis with other examples of powerful women throughout history. Your case provides insights into how different societies have dealt with female rulers who violated conventional moral expectations. Comparisons with figures like Catherine the Great of Russia, who also had numerous lovers but managed to maintain political effectiveness, reveal the importance of discretion in managing sexual scandals. Catherine's affairs were relatively private and didn't interfere with her governance, while your sexual activities were deliberately public and politically disruptive. Comparisons with Henry VIII's wives, particularly Catherine Howard, show how different political systems handle adultery by royal consorts. Catherine Howard was also executed for adultery, but only after a formal trial and legal proceedings. Your execution was swift and extra-legal, reflecting the more autocratic nature of Roman imperial power. Analysis of your behavior alongside that of other Roman imperial family members reveals patterns in how absolute power affected different personalities. While Caligula's excesses were primarily political and religious, and Nero's were mainly artistic and theatrical, yours were uniquely sexual and social. This suggests that the corrupting influence of absolute power manifests differently depending on individual psychology and interests. Some people use unlimited authority to pursue political domination, others seek artistic expression, and still others, like you, focus on personal gratification. The specific nature of your crimes, adultery, sexual competition, public humiliation of your husband, reflected Roman anxieties about female sexuality and its potential threat to social order. Other cultures with different gender norms and sexual values might have responded to your behavior differently. Some might have been more tolerant of your sexual activities, while being less forgiving of your political implications. Others might have focused more on your violation of religious taboos than on your challenge to imperial authority. The comparative approach reveals that your story, while uniquely Roman in its details, reflects universal tensions between individual desire and social constraint that appear in different forms across cultures and historical periods. Modern archaeological research has added another dimension to understanding your story by providing physical evidence of the world you inhabited. Excavations of imperial palaces, Roman brothels and elite residences have revealed details about the material culture that surrounded your activities. Archaeological evidence from the imperial palace complex shows the kind of luxury and privacy that made your behavior possible. The complex included numerous private apartments, secluded gardens, and discreet entrances that would have allowed you to conduct affairs without public notice. Excavations in Rome's red light district have revealed the physical layout of the brothels where you conducted your competitions. These establishments were larger and more elaborate than previously thought, suggesting they catered to wealthy clientele and could have accommodated the kind of public spectacles you participated in. Analysis of Roman dining facilities and entertainment spaces provides insights into the parties and gatherings where your sexual activities often began. The size and sophistication of these venues show how imperial social events could easily transform into private sexual encounters. Archaeological evidence also reveals the extensive servant and security infrastructure that would have been necessary to facilitate and conceal your activities. The number of people who must have been involved in your scandals was far larger than literary sources suggest. Physical evidence from Roman tombs and monuments shows how quickly your name and image were removed from public spaces after your execution. The systematic erasure of your presence from archaeological sites confirms the literary accounts of official attempts to delete you from history. Study of Roman religious sites reveals the extent of the purification rituals that were conducted after your death. Evidence of unusual sacrificial activities and temple renovations suggests that the religious contamination caused by your behavior was taken very seriously by contemporary authorities. The archaeological record thus provides confirmation for many details of your story, while also revealing aspects of Roman imperial life that aren't captured in literary sources. It shows the material infrastructure that made your behavior possible, and the practical measures taken to deal with its consequences. Modern economic historians have examined your story as a case study in how personal behavior by powerful individuals can have broader economic consequences. Your activities created costs and market distortions that affected the entire Roman economy. The direct costs of your behavior were substantial. Imperial expenditures on your parties, gifts to your lovers, and bribes to maintain secrecy diverted significant resources from legitimate government functions. These weren't just personal expenses, they were funded by tax revenues that could have been used for infrastructure, military operations, or public welfare. Your activities also created what economists call moral hazard, situations where people engage in risky behavior because they don't bear the full cost of potential consequences. Your servants, guards, and associates were incentivized to facilitate your scandals because they were rewarded for compliance and punished for resistance. The market distortions you created in Rome's sex industry were particularly significant. Your participation in brothel competitions artificially inflated prices and created unfair competitive conditions. Professional prostitutes couldn't compete with someone who had unlimited imperial resources and could afford to work for symbolic payment. Your behavior also affected labor markets by creating demand for services that were legally questionable and socially destructive. People were employed as procurers, guards, and facilitators for activities that ultimately weakened imperial authority and social stability. The uncertainty created by your scandals had broader economic effects through their impact on political stability. Foreign traders and investors became more cautious about Roman markets when they learned that the imperial family was engaging in behavior that could lead to political crisis. The costs of cleaning up after your death were also substantial. Legal settlements, property damage, lost productivity from the purges that followed your execution. All of these represented economic losses that persisted long after your personal crimes had ended. Economic analysis of your story thus reveals another dimension of how individual moral failures can have systemic consequences. Your personal choices to prioritize immediate gratification over long-term stability created economic costs that were ultimately borne by the entire Roman society. Modern gender studies scholars have found your story particularly relevant to understanding how societies construct and police female sexuality. Your case provides insights into the mechanisms through which powerful women are controlled and the consequences of challenging gender norms. From this perspective, your story isn't primarily about individual moral failure, but about the collision between female agency and patriarchal authority. You were operating within a system that gave you significant power, but only as long as you used that power in ways that didn't threaten male dominance. Your sexual activities can be understood as an assertion of female autonomy that violated fundamental assumptions about how women should behave. By taking multiple partners, competing with prostitutes, and publicly humiliating your husband, you were claiming rights that Roman society reserved for men. The swift and violent response to your behavior reveals the anxiety that female sexual autonomy provoked in Roman society. Your execution wasn't just punishment for specific crimes, but a reassertion of patriarchal control over female sexuality. The way your story has been told and retold over the centuries also reflects changing attitudes toward female power and sexuality. Each generation has interpreted your behavior through the lens of its own gender norms and anxieties. Medieval writers who emphasized your spiritual corruption were reflecting Christian teachings about female sexuality as inherently dangerous and corrupting. Renaissance authors who focused on political implications were grappling with questions about female rule that were relevant to their own times. Modern treatments that attempt psychological analysis reflecting contemporary efforts to understand female behavior as something more complex than simple moral categories of good and evil. The gender studies perspective doesn't excuse or justify your behavior, but it does place it within a broader context of how societies manage female power and sexuality. Your story becomes a case study in the mechanisms through which patriarchal societies maintain control over women who might otherwise challenge established gender hierarchies. This analytical framework helps explain why your story has remained compelling across different historical periods. Each society that encounters your tale must grapple with its own assumptions about appropriate female behavior and the consequences of violating those assumptions. Your influence extends even into the modern world, where your name and story continue to serve as reference points for discussions about power, sexuality, and moral behavior. contemporary politicians, celebrities, and other public figures who engage in sexual scandals are often compared to you, though usually without full understanding of the historical context. Modern media coverage of political sex scandals frequently uses language and concepts that can be traced back to ancient accounts of your behavior. The idea that private sexual conduct reflects on public character, the assumption that sexual promiscuity indicates moral corruption, the expectation that public figures should be held to higher moral standards. All of these contemporary attitudes have roots in the Roman response to your scandals. Your story has also influenced modern literature, film, and television in ways that aren't always obvious. The archetype of the sexually voracious woman who uses her beauty and power to corrupt and destroy others appears throughout popular culture, often with clear connections to your historical example. Legal scholars have examined your case for insights into how different societies handle conflicts between personal behavior and public authority. The extra-legal nature of your execution raises questions about due process and the rule of law that remain relevant in contemporary discussions about government accountability. Even popular psychology and self-help literature sometimes reference your story as an extreme example of what happens when people pursue immediate gratification without considering long-term consequences. Your case serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of self-control and moral restraint. The persistence of your influence nearly 2,000 years after your death suggests that your story touches on fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization that transcend specific historical periods and cultural contexts. Perhaps the most significant aspect of your legacy is the way your story continues to raise questions that every society must answer for itself. How much personal freedom should powerful people have? What is the relationship between private morality and public authority? How should societies balance individual desires against collective needs? Your behavior forced Roman society to confront these questions in the starkest possible terms. You had pushed every boundary until the contradictions in imperial ideology became impossible to ignore. The Roman response to your scandals reveals their answers to these fundamental questions, but those answers aren't necessarily the ones that other societies would choose. Modern democracies face similar challenges when public figures engage in behavior that violates social norms. The specific details are different, but the underlying tensions between individual freedom and collective expectations remain the same. Your story also raises questions about the nature of power itself. Does absolute power inevitably lead to absolute corruption? Are there personal qualities that make some individuals more susceptible to the corrupting influence of power than others? Can institutional constraints effectively limit the behavior of people who have access to unlimited resources and authority? These questions don't have simple answers, which is why your story remains compelling. Each society, each generation, each individual who encounters your tale must wrestle with these fundamental issues and reach their own conclusions about how power should be exercised and constrained. The moral dimension of your story is equally complex. While few people would defend your specific actions, the broader questions about sexual freedom, individual autonomy, and social constraint that your behavior raised are still being debated today. Your case forces us to consider whether moral standards should be universal or contextual, whether powerful people should be held to higher or different standards than ordinary citizens, and whether private behavior should have public consequences. These are not merely academic questions. They affect how we structure our political systems, how we choose our leaders, and how we balance competing values like freedom, order, security, and justice. Your story endures because it provides a concrete historical example of what happens when these abstract questions are played out in real life with real consequences. You lived the contradictions that other people only theorize about, and your destruction illustrates the real-world stakes involved in these eternal human dilemmas. In the end, perhaps that's your most significant contribution to human understanding, not any particular lesson about right and wrong, but rather a perfect illustration of the complexity and difficulty of the moral choices that every society must make. Your life and death serve as a permanent reminder that these choices have consequences, that individual behavior affects collective welfare, and that even the most powerful people operate within systems larger than themselves. Valeria Messalina, empress, adulteress, bigamist, traitor, victim, symbol, and ultimately, a mirror in which every society can see its own struggles with the eternal human challenge of balancing individual desires against collective needs. Your story ends not with answers but with questions that will persist as long as human beings live together in organized societies and struggle to reconcile personal freedom with social responsibility.